Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 3, Lesson 16 of We the People. Now, Lesson 16 talks about the powers given to the executive and judicial branches by the Constitution. Now, let's begin, because class is in session. So, starting off, in 1787, after America broke away from Britain, they still remember the experiences they faced with the executive branch of the British government. Remembering the unfair treatment they received posed a challenge for the Founding Fathers in creating the new government. And so then came the U.S. Constitution. Now, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution is about the executive branch. It lists the powers and responsibilities it has, like enforcing the laws, making treaties, appointing officials, being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and vetoing laws made by Congress. Now, since the President is the head of the executive branch and commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a question that is commonly asked is it important for the President and commander-in-chief to be a civilian? I would say that it's important for the President to be a civilian, since a government with a military executive would be called a military democracy or a military junta, where the army or military is in control, usually in a war-ridden country. The Constitution also creates something called checks and balances, which is how each branch can check the power of the other. The executive branch has many limitations since the people don't want a dictator or an unfair ruler. The executive branch shares its power with Congress or the legislative branch, which means there are limitations. For example, the President can nominate officials for office, but without advice and consent, meaning Congress or the Senate must approve nominations, nothing can happen. The President can make treaties with other foreign nations, but the Senate must approve them. Again, this is called advice and consent. Now, why would the Constitution require the President and Congress to share power when negotiating treaties? And the answer to that, as stated in Senate.gov, is firstly to check the presidential power, second, to benefit the President with advice and counsel of the Senate, and third, to give each state an equal vote in the treaty-making process, which would secure the state's sovereignty. The President is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which means he directs them in war. But the legislative branch is the only one that can actually declare and fund a war. The President can veto or reject bills, but the Congress can override the presidential veto with 2/3 of a vote in both houses. Now, why did the framers allow the President to veto bills passed by Congress? And according to archives.gov, the presidential veto is to prevent the abuse of power in the legislative branch. Another major check on the executive branch is impeachment. Impeachment, or to bring to trial, is the power of the House of Representatives to remove the President from office if he or she has committed a crime or obstructed justice. This power of impeachment prevents tyranny and abuse in the executive branch. The question of why the President can be impeached has a pretty straightforward answer, and that is, of course, to prevent tyranny and abuse of power if the President has committed a crime or has an issue with misconduct in office, as stated in theconstitutioncenter.org. Selecting a president at first wasn't a worry to the founders, since they had Washington, who the people supported and adored. They needed a system for selecting future presidents, so they decided that a president would serve for 4 years,
and could be re-elected as many times as possible. Then the Second Amendment changed that. The Second Amendment says that the president can only be re-elected once and serves for a term of 4 years. Having the people select the president directly wouldn't work out, and having Congress select the president would make a weak executive branch. The founders then came up with the Electoral College as a way to select the new president. The Electoral College consists of electors from each state. Each state's electors depends on the number of senators and representatives the state has. The candidate with the most votes in the Electoral College is president. The House of Representatives votes for president if no candidate has a majority vote. What qualifications should a person have in order to become the president of the United States? A person running for president should be a natural-born citizen, be 35 years of age, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. The president's duties include carrying out the laws, acting as commander-in-chief, making treaties with foreign nations, and appointing government officials. The president's powers include vetoing laws, granting pardons, granting reprieves, and nominating judges and justices. Limits on the president's powers include needing Senate approval for declaring war and nominating officials, and Congress can override presidential vetoes. The third branch, the judicial branch, completes a system of checks and balances. The Constitution sets up the judicial branch in Article 3 and gives it their powers. Some ideas about the judiciary in Article 3 are that judges aren't elected in order to keep them independent. They serve for life unless impeached or retired, and there should only be one Supreme Court with original and appellate jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the court's authority to hear a case. Original jurisdiction means the case begins at the Supreme Court, and appellate jurisdiction means the case already went to a lower court but was appealed. The Supreme Court can overrule laws of Congress on the account that they violate the U.S. Constitution. This power comes from the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Federal laws are also supreme if there's any issue with a state law. Why are Supreme Court justices appointed rather than elected? The Constitution already grants the executive branch the power to appoint justices rather than have the people elect them. This keeps the justices as independent politics. And that, folks, concludes the end of Lesson 16 of We the People.